In 1989, I became a college chapter president for my fraternity. And then it happened again in 1991. In 2003, I became an alumni chapter president of my fraternity. It was rough. I had no earthly idea what I was doing. My idea of leadership was basically to try to know it all and to do it all, and also to try to do things mistake free. So you know what happened? Since I was so afraid of failing, I tried to be a voice of dominance. I kid you not, in a couple of meetings, I literally pounded my fist on the table out of frustration. Yeah, I had a lot of fun. I'm sure if you've been through a leadership training, especially recently, your thought is, yikes. Yikes is exactly right. Listen, this is what I want to do. This episode of Ethocast, I want to dedicate time to really digging into the importance of understanding the leader-follower relationship. Because as someone who is in Greek life, this is going to save you a lot of grief. We have three things that we're going to take away from this. First, you're going to learn how leadership has changed over the course of time, because it really has. Second, you're going to learn the definition of the leader-follower relationship. And third, you're going to learn how personalities come into play. Let's talk about it. The views expressed on Ethocast do not necessarily reflect the views of the hosts, guests, or any entities with which this podcast's participants are affiliated. Questions, comments, email eddie@eddiefrancis.com. So there's this scholar out of Australia named Gail Avery. Avery theorized that there are 4 leadership paradigms that the world has gone through since the beginning of time. And she really frames this more as organizational leadership, but I think it can be loosely applied to community leadership. But for the purposes of this podcast, we are talking about organizational leadership. So what is the first paradigm? It's called classical leadership, from antiquity until the 1970s. So what Avery theorized is that leader dominance was done more through command and control or through gaining respect in some sort of way. The follower was either rewarded or punished in some sort of way. So if you think about your classic monarchy, or if you think about an authoritarian style of leadership, it's normally what we saw a lot of times. And then there is another paradigm of leadership that took root in the 70s and went on through the mid-1980s, and Avery calls that transactional leadership. In transactional leadership, the leader makes things happen through interpersonal influence. And so what happens is that the leader creates this environment of what Avery calls appropriate management. The follower, though, receives negotiated rewards and also agreements. And then also they have these expectations that are created that guides their commitment. Now, in the mid-1980s through the end of the 20th century, Avery saw a style of leadership called visionary leadership. As a matter of fact, visionary leadership is still a pretty popular style of leadership. Because what the leader does is the leader inspires by creating a vision, right? And this isn't like the other paradigms. The other paradigms, the leader didn't have to worry about a vision because all the leader had to do was say go and people would go that way. Well, now the leader is noticing something different in the masses. And so the follower commits to the vision that the leader has. But what's going on is that the leader is really showing some sort of charisma or doing something to attract the follower, because the leader is getting buy-in from the follower in order to carry the vision out. So now what do we have in the 21st century? In the 21st century, we have the paradigm of organic leadership. Organic leadership, the leader is actually part of the culture of what's happening within that organization. And the leader, instead of being appointed or inheriting leadership emerges from the culture of that organization. The follower has a little bit more power here. As a matter of fact, the follower has a lot more power here because the follower is the one who's responsible for forming this culture. The follower has the shared beliefs, the values, the traditions, the symbols that create the culture, and the leader is a product of that. So you also have in this shared processes. You have self-determination that comes into play. And so where the vision comes from for the leader here, it really comes from the people. It comes from the culture itself. It comes from the followers. Does this sound familiar? It should. Because isn't this how fraternities and sororities tend to operate a lot of times? Sure, we have our leaders. We have our national, international leaders. We have our regional leaders, district leaders, chapter leaders, area leaders, right? But since theoretically we are brothers and sisters, we're all supposed to have the same voice. And if we're all supposed to have the same voice, we have this person who has been initiated into our fraternity or sorority. And this person, it comes from the culture of their chapter. They come from the culture of their region, of the state that they're in, the culture of the campus. They rise through the culture of the organization, and they become the president or the international president of our fraternity or sorority. And the thing that's really beautiful about it, and I think this is why the paradigms have changed so much, especially the way it has changed in the 21st century, is diversity. Diversity of thought first, but also diversity when it comes to ethnicity, nationality, when it comes down to gender, when it comes down to ability, religion. All these different dimensions of diversity contribute to the culture really creating the leader, especially in fraternities and sororities. This is why I like to say that leadership is a people thing. You, again, like I said in the beginning, you can try to create and analyze data without people. You can try to implement processes without people. You can try to make the sale without people, but you're not going to be able to do it, are you? So here's what happened in the leadership studies community. With these changes in leadership over the course of time, of course, there have been a lot of changes in how people have studied leadership. Most of the time, scholars have looked at leadership based on the leader himself, in most cases, himself. But they realized something at some point. They realized that, number one, him isn't always going to be a him. They also realized that there are these other people, they're called followers. And guess what? Followers have agendas and they make decisions and they influence the way things go in an organization. And when followers are ignored, they tend to rebel. And so the leadership studies community started to take a much closer look at followers, to understand the behaviors of followers and to understand how followers influence leaders. So when they started to really look at leadership theory, they started developing what was called contingency theories. A contingency theory is just what it sounds like. The effectiveness of a leader is contingent on the relationship that they have with the followers. One of the theories that I really like, and I use it as the framework for my master's final project, is the leader-member exchange theory, or the LMX as it's called. Here's how the LMX works. I talk about this in my followership to leadership presentation. In LMX, the leader forms two types of exchanges with people: high quality exchanges and low quality exchanges. The high quality exchanges that leaders have with followers is usually all about them being able to communicate in a pretty healthy feedback loop a lot of times. They've established some great interactions, some great relationships. And because of those interactions, those relationships, the communication, the feedback, they're able to push the organization forward somehow. Low quality exchanges, it doesn't mean that the organization doesn't move forward, but the process is a little slower. And the reason is the exchanges are really just out of obligation. In other words, a low quality exchange is the follower saying, all right, I'm going to do my job today. I don't really have to like you, and I don't have to sing your praises, but I do have to do my job. That's what a low quality exchange tends to look like. People doing things simply out of a contractual obligation of some kind. So let's take a look at the second element here. The second big thing to talk about is what exactly is the leader-follower relationship. When leaders form relationships with followers, it's usually done with the people who are within their sphere of influence. So let's look at the size of a chapter, for example. If you listen to episode Zeta of Ethocast, I had Sarah Colazzo on. I joked with Sarah about having been a chapter president in college with 10 members. Sarah was a chapter president of her Zeta Tau Alpha chapter of 200 members. And what did that look like for us? I'm not going to attempt to speak for Sarah, certainly, but I can say that for me, having 10 members in my chapter, it really wasn't that hard for me to form a relationship with every single member of the chapter. Everybody was within my sphere of influence. But for Sarah, I wouldn't be surprised if it was a little different having 200 women in her chapter. And so she can only reach so many people, and she can only have a robust relationship with so many people. So who are these people that she has this relationship with, or who any chapter president of a large chapter is going to have relationships with? Well, that group is called an in-group. It's the group that is closest to the leader that tends to have high quality exchanges with the leader. And when you have the in-group tends to be the nucleus of what happens a lot of times within the chapter. Now, this doesn't necessarily mean that a smaller chapter is going to run better. It's quite it can be quite the opposite sometimes. Because when relationships break apart in a smaller chapter, they break apart pretty badly because you only have so many people in the first place. And so I would argue that the leader-follower relationship in a smaller chapter is extraordinarily important, maybe more important than a bigger chapter. But I'm not gonna go ahead and put my stamp on that, because everything works a certain way in every group. It depends on that group. So this is why when someone takes on a leadership role, I think it's really important for the leader to have a trusted advisor, or trusted advisors, people who are going to help guide the leader, people who are going to help the leader understand what's happening in the chapter, the people who are going to help the leader make decisions in the most effective way possible for the sake of the chapter. But let's take a look at the follower end, because as we pointed out earlier, the follower counts too. And the follower has a set of behaviors that influence the leader's perception. Now, there is this thing called followership, and I'm going to talk about followership on a later episode. But what this does is it puts the follower squarely in the leadership process. All right, let's pause for a second on that word process. I think one of the biggest mistakes we make when it comes to leadership, especially when people throw us in the deep end and tell us, okay, just go ahead and lead this chapter, man. Do your best. I know you can do it. or when someone gets elected to that district position, or they get elected to that regional position, or they get elected to that national, international presidency, and they're not necessarily understanding the dynamics of leadership, the mistake that a lot of us make is that we look at leadership as a title, we look at it as a position, we look at it as a status. Actually, I'm going to argue, let's argue, that leadership is more of a process. The reason I say that is you think back to the paradigms that I just talked about. With these paradigms, there was a lot of change because of diversity of thought, diversity of nationality, companies becoming bigger, becoming global. And so what happens with all of these companies becoming much more global, or what happens as you put a national leader more on a worldwide stage, is that more diverse groups of people see that leader, they see the leadership, and so they have a lot more to say about what's happening with leadership. And so what does the leader have to do? The leader has to constantly learn. The leader has to constantly learn. And that learning is a process. So to me, leadership is a process, and followers are a part of that process. But see, followers also influence other followers. We've seen this before, right? Leader makes a decision that folks don't like. One chapter member tells another chapter member who talks to another chapter member who talks to another chapter member. Nobody's talking to the chapter president, but the chapter members are all talking to each other. All of a sudden, the chapter president sees behaviors and they're going, what in the entire HE double hockey sticks is going on with this chapter? And because the followers have that kind of influence, then the leader has behaviors that change as well. Or the leader has behaviors in response to what they're getting back from the chapter. So where does the rubber meet the road with all of these exchanges? Well, the rubber meets the road in personality. You got to understand people's personalities. Now, have you ever wondered why it is that certain fraternity brothers and sorority sisters act the way they do? Well, it's the type of personality that they have. If you can understand someone's personality, then you can understand their behaviors and you can understand their perceptions of things. You can also understand their attitudes. And you can even understand your own attitude, because something that they do can make you really reflect on what you're doing and why you're doing it. So how do you understand personality? Well, you got to be able to put this stuff into words. You need the language. So let's talk about this third thing. And this third thing is, how do you really grab an understanding of the people's personalities, especially those who are in the follower positions? There was this model developed to understand the dimensions of personality. It's called the Big Five model of personality, or also the 5-factor model of personality. It says that these five dimensions all have within each one a range of traits, right? Because how is a personality made up? A personality is made up of traits. And the 5 dimensions that we have in this Big Five or 5-factor model, however you want to refer to it, are extroversion, agreeableness, openness, conscientiousness, and neuroticism. So let's look at extroversion first. Extroversion, you have a spectrum. And on one end of this spectrum is an outgoing personality, and on the other end is a reserved personality. Outgoing is the high end of extroversion, and then reserved is the low end of extroversion. Second, you have agreeableness. And we're going to go from high to low in each one. Agreeableness exists on a spectrum from cooperation to competitiveness. So yes, cooperation is high agreeableness, and then competitiveness is low agreeableness. And then you have the third dimension, openness. Openness exists between being adventurous and traditional. Now you have conscientiousness. With conscientiousness, you have a dimension between organized and less structured. And then you have neuroticism. Now, neuroticism, listen really closely here, is really much more about moods and emotions. So with neuroticism, you have a lot of movement happening with people. And so the high end of neuroticism is anxiety. The low end is resilience. Now, if you understand your own personality, then you can figure out how to communicate with other people after you've understood their personality. It's a lot of work, but it is something you really should know. And when it came down to the leadership research that had been done before, when they were just looking at leaders, a lot of this started with looking at leader personalities. But now we are getting into follower personalities, which takes us into followership. And if you can understand yourself throughout these dimensions, then you can figure out, number one, how to build self-awareness. And by building self-awareness, you can figure out how to communicate and how to collaborate. So I know that for me, I am high in extroversion. I am outgoing. I am high in agreeableness. I am cooperative. Although I will say for a long time, I was low in agreeableness. So yeah, we talked about how identities change. Yeah, personalities change. Openness. Yeah, I have been pretty high in openness pretty much my life so far. Conscientiousness, I'm definitely low in conscientiousness. I'm not very structured all the time. And then neuroticism, I think I tend to be pretty low in neuroticism. I'm pretty resilient. So I know that as a leader, if these are my dimensions, I'm going to need someone to really help me temper each one. Definitely with conscientiousness, I need someone who is high in conscientiousness. I need someone who is organized. When it comes to extroversion, oh yeah, look, life is a stage for me a lot of times. So I am high in extroversion. I am outgoing, and it really helps to have someone who is low in extroversion to temper me a lot of times. And by understanding that, number one, like I said, I have self-awareness. So I know that I'm going to want to get a vice president who can temper all of these different dimensions. And if I do have someone, oh, by the way, this does not mean I'm running for a chapter president again. But even if I have someone who is about the same, I at least want to be able to communicate with this person to say, okay, listen, we are both extroverts. We need to figure out how to cater to the introverts in the chapter. So the key to understanding a successful leader-follower relationship is you got to have the will to work. Number one, you got to have the will to work on yourself. You got to build your self-awareness. But you also have to have the will to work with others so that you can communicate with them and you can collaborate with them. At the end of the day, here's where we are. Fraternity and sorority life is all about working together. However, you can't force it. A big part of this is understanding how to discern the best ways to work with one another based on what we understand about ourselves and based on what we're able to pick up about other people. That's why it's important to understand these personalities. That's why it's important to understand that the leader-follower relationship is just that, a relationship. And that's why it's important to understand also that leadership has evolved and guess what? Is going to continue to evolve. So if you can discern all of these things, then you can figure out how to meet people where they are, and they can figure out how to meet you where you are. So I hope all of that makes sense. And I hope it's helpful to you. Thank you so much for checking out this episode of Ethocast, episode Ada. I'm going to see you for the next one. And if you have anything for me, a response or anything like that, please feel free to email me, Eddie@eddiefrancis.com. Until next time.